Okay, okay. So we can start. So we reached our sixth session on systemology. We have about four presentations today because unfortunately Professor O'Hare cannot develop her report on international commercial courts. And we all wish her our best wishes. And so I will start with Professor Kelly CHEN, who's of the University of Stockholm, whose report is about new sources of normativity and comparative law, EU, China, and financial markets. So please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Professor MONATERI. I just want to start with saying thank you so much to all the organizers. It's a shame that we can't meet in person, but all the work that you put into turning this conference into a webinar instead. So thank you so much for making this possible. And for my presentation, I have prepared a few slides. So I'm going to try to share my screen with you.
Yes, sure, yeah, sure, you can.
Can you see my slides?
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, thank you. Great. So my topic today is new sources of normativity and comparative law. And more specifically, I want to talk a little bit about how the emergence of new supranational, global, transnational, and private, and also non-Western source of normativity has affected the methodology adopted to analyze and compare issues in the international financial markets. This paper that my presentation is based on is part of a research project that I started last year at the Faculty of Law, Stockholm University. And the project is dedicated to analyzing how to conduct legal studies, and especially comparative legal studies, in pluralistic regulatory landscapes, such as the one that you can find in the financial markets. Because if we take a look at the variety of sources of normativity in the international financial markets, it becomes quite clear that it is composed of a wide range of sources of various nature. And just to give you a few examples, you have, for example, supranational ones, such as the European Union. You have global ones in terms of the Group of 20, G20. And you have transnational ones, because there are so-called transnational regulatory networks in global finance. A very good example is the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. And you also have private ones, as in industry organizations. And something that I'm looking into is that in recent years, China, now being home to 4 global systematically important banks, it is no longer only an important stakeholder in the international markets as a market participant, but is now also playing a more active role in the regulation and governance of global finance. So in my work, I use China as an example of a non-Western source of normativity in global finance. And moreover, these different sources of normativity, the way that they interact with each other in the global sphere, they can create new normative structures that diverge from traditional international law orders. And with this, I mean that if you compare, for example, how global finance is regulated, and you compare with international trade or international investments, for example, you can see that global finance is not regulated in a way as in trade. In trade, you have, for example, WTO, international trade, being the apex of the regulation of international trade. And you have countries that enter into binding treaties with each other. But when it comes to finance, in a summarized way, you can say that the regulation of global finance is centered on informal networks of financial regulators, national financial regulators, and that develop soft law regulatory standards for states to implement at the domestic level. And on this slide, I have a new order in global finance question mark. And with new, I'm not saying that these networks and so on are new, they're built from scratch or something. Many of them have existed for a couple of decades now. With new, it refers to the institutional reforms that this framework has experienced since the financial crisis of 2008. We all know that the financial crisis triggered, such reform across the globe. It changed the regulatory landscape at the local and global level in so many ways. And at the global level, it triggered a number of institutional reforms that made this structure more clear in terms of the division of functions with agenda setting, coordination and standard setting, monitoring, and so on, and how the different levels of this framework is connected and relate to each other. So this is what I mean with new. And if I can just give you a very simple example of how norm-making processes look like in this order, in this framework. Let's take banking regulation as an example. You can see that when it comes to standard setting in banking, you have the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. It is composed of national central banks and banking supervisory authorities from 20-something, almost 30 jurisdictions. They come together and develop a set of global standards in banking regulation supervision. And this set is generally referred to as Basel III. And you have a number of key economies around the world. You have the European countries, the US, China, Australia, all of them have implemented Basel III. And well, Basel Committee is recognized as a prime global standard setter in banking. It is not a formal international organization. It holds no legal status under public international law. The standards developed, Basel III, is a set of soft law and has no legally binding effect. It is explicitly stated in the Basel Committee Charter that Basel Committee has no formal supranational authority and its decisions no legal force. So in order for these standards to have a legally binding effect, they have to be incorporated into the local frameworks. And this is done through each implementing state's domestic lawmaking process. And how can we make sure that states actually implement these soft law standards? There are no international court of finance. There are no dispute settlement systems. Instead, compliance is ensured by a monitoring program performed by the IMF and World Bank. What they do is that they assess the financial stability of a state jurisdiction by using the standards developed by these transnational regulatory networks. And today, after financial crisis, because of the reforms, we have 29 jurisdictions of systematically important financial markets that are assessed on a mandatory basis every 5 years. So I'm doing this and showing you this mostly just to emphasize that these kind of regulatory processes at global level, they have not replaced each state's domestic lawmaking process. What they do, the point is more that they are connected to each other, how local and the global are connected to each other. And this regulatory framework is based on a number of interesting points of interface. You have, for example, national regulators that come together in these transnational networks. And you have the interface between informal transnational networks and formal international organizations. has seen how the IMF and World Bank are endorsing the soft law standards. And you have the interface of soft law standards that are being transformed to hard law financial regulations. And I just want to say a few words about another part of this regulatory network and regulatory landscape, which is private rulemaking. Because in addition to different standard setting bodies that are composed of national regulators, there are also standard setting networks that are composed of private experts, so private individuals. An example is the International Accounting Standards Board, which is composed of a number of private market professionals, and they develop global standards in accounting and auditing. And another example is on private rulemaking in global finance is International Swaps and Derivatives Association, ISTA, which is an industry organization that promotes best practices and develops standard contracts for its members. And the operation of ISTA has often been recognized as a really good example of transnational private rulemaking. I think that is important to just emphasize that this type of normemaking is an important part of the regulatory landscape as well. And it is an example of an emerging lex financiaria, which is similar to the Institute of Lex Victoria, but it is in finance. And it is, if you take a deeper look at closer look at how the regulatory framework looks like, it is actually composed of an interface between the sources of normativity of private character as well as these transnational regulatory networks of public regulators. So this framework is shaped by a combination of traditional sources of normativity, as in nation states and international organizations, but also with these types of so-called new sources of normativity, and they exist alongside and interact with each other. And more regulations in different parts of the financial markets are now coming from this global source. So if we can get a really in-depth understanding of how this framework works, then it would contribute to the understanding, systematic understanding, and the possibility to enhance financial regulation at the global as well as the local level. So for example, if we can do comparisons, if we compare and identify and analyze the differences and similarities between formal international normative orders and these kind of informal orders, then you can see how different regulatory regimes, how they function, they can be revealed. So comparative inquiries can be expanded to include other normative orders than traditional ones based on the convention notion of nation states. And we can capture a legal reality where law no longer falls under the exclusive domain of nation states. And in this way, we can gain a deeper understanding of how global norms are shaped today. And another example of comparative analysis in this field is if we conduct legal transfer analysis, it can show how financial regulatory standards can migrate across the globe, horizontally, vertically, and up and down. Because if we take a look at how this framework, the institutional reforms that it has experienced, that it has become more, it can look like it is, the normating process is more vertical, a top-down, global to local process. But we need to remember that in these standard setting bodies, they are composed of national regulators. And the standards developed are actually, they result from cooperation, including convergence and divergence between these national norm setters. So the norm making process can be viewed as a bottom-up process as well. So because in these networks, it has been argued that national regulators, they do not only attempt to shape how their own domestic markets are supposed to be regulated, they want to push, they also seek to push and promote their own regulatory approaches to other states to follow. So if we do a vertical bottom-up analysis, you can show how financial regulatory practices can migrate from a local source into these transnational networks, develop into a global norm, and then implemented in other local markets. So migration of norms today, they don't have to, not necessarily follow the traditional path of state-to-state transfer, but it can also be migrated through these new global regulatory processes. So I covered the first and the second point here. And the last point is that can we use comparative studies, comparative work to see the impact of globalization in different legal systems? Because many times when we do comparisons, we compare the financial regulation, the substantive regulations in different markets, for example, between Sweden or China. And so we compare, the results after that being implemented in the local setting. But if we compare the points of interface between the global and local, the examples that I gave you, you can actually get a better understanding of why there might be similarities, because they come from the same global source, and also differences because these global norms are localized in the implementing process. So sometimes you can have a tool that can seem very globalized.
Dr. Chen, we can't hear you any longer. Sorry,
okay.
We've lost you. You have to speak near the microphone because we haven't heard your last phrase.
Okay, so where did from where should I start again?
Now you can go on. We just lost only 2 sentences, but it was evident that we were going to lose you. Now you can start again from whence you were.
Okay, so I am on the last point, basically how we can use comparative analysis to study the impact of globalization in different financial regulatory frameworks. Because if we compare the points of interface between the global and local, you can see that sometimes you can have similarities between 2 different markers, and that's because they derive from the same global source. But you can also see why you have differences, because these global norms are localized in the implementing process. So you can have an area that can seem very globalized at the first sight, but then if you take this deeper in-depth comparative analysis, you can see that it is much more local than it first appears. I am on my just the final point. I just want to present an idea about how we can develop this kind of idea, like how global governance structures can serve as a source of norm migration. Something that I'm working on right now is I'm looking into the topic of sustainable finance. And very briefly, sustainable finance is the idea of to build legal frameworks that can promote the financial sector to contribute to the development of a green and inclusive economy. So this is generally what we refer to as green and sustainable finance. And at the global level, sustainable finance has not taken the traditional path of international law, but it has been, following the roots of these global regulatory processes that center on networks of experts. And so when in my work, I'm looking at how states can use this regulatory process, regulatory structure to export their own norms. And this topic, I think, is especially interesting and important to developing and emerging countries, because many times these so-called global norms are designed to meet the conditions of developed countries, so the financial elites of the world. But as emerging and developing countries are becoming more and more important stakeholders in the global financial system, there is a need for them to become more active in the shaping of these global norms as well. In my work, I use China as a case in point. and look at how states, for example, or sources such as China, can use these global structures to shift from a norm importer, meaning that only importing norms, to actually actively taking part in the shaping of these global norms and potentially shift to a norm exporter. Yeah, and that was my final slide. I'm gonna stop sharing.
All right. Okay.
Can you see me now?
Okay, yeah, we see you. So you're over?
Yes. So
Yes,
thank
okay.
you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor Kelly, for this intriguing analysis. And we have minutes for debate. So please, there are questions or remarks? Yes, Alessandro Somma.
I'm gonna get pen and paper.
Oh, yes, sure. Okay, great. Please, you have the floor.
Thank you for your speech. You mentioned at the very beginning of your speech the idea of a pluralistic regulatory landscape. And I wonder if one can say the same thing about the word of values. I mean, the values which are enhanced, implemented by this regulatory landscape. Maybe a focus on the clash between the local and the global level could give some answer to this point of view. I mean, in the end of your speech, you mentioned something discussing the idea of sustainable finance. You went into the issue of values. But I would ask you to deepen a little bit this part, because to me, a contribution of comparative law on this issue would mean exactly to stress the link between techniques, the idea of pluralistic regulatory landscape, for example, and the values which are at stake in this developing system. Thank you.
What do you prefer? Just one question and you answer, or you prefer a debate?
It is up to you, up to the moderator.
Okay. It's a rather complex for you to answer now.
That was. I can just say that I think it was such really important and interesting thoughts and the question, because I agree that this is about values. When we talk about regulating the financial markets and how to use the financial sector to promote certain values, such as sustainable development, then you will have clashes between, the local level and the global level, and between different states. And this is why I think it can be an interesting case in point to study. Is it possible for emerging and developing countries to use these global structures to export their values? Is that something, am I?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Does it connect to? Well, yeah.
Please, someone else?
Yes, I have a question regarding the network analysis, which I will touch base also. So I'm glad you covered this aspect. There was one thing, because probably I'm biased since I work in the corporate side. So my question is, why do we need regulation in financial markets? Why regulation is up there? You were mentioning that there was this issue of corporate responsibility, so we have to enhance something. Maybe there are some values over there, but I really don't see why regulation in financial markets. And I think that you should point out what are the downsides of not having regulation in your paper, because otherwise it seems like a really nice setting of informative operational parts on networks, but what do this study give us? What are the implications of this study? Why do we need regulation in financial markets? And probably this is biased, as I said before, because I came from the corporate side, and America, you know that they don't have strong regulation of financial markets, and it's a strong market. What is your argumentation towards an American that wants to follow your paper?
Can I respond to that?
Yes, sure.
I think that's a very valid point, and I fully understand where you're coming from. But let me pose a counter question. What happened in the financial crisis? Can we trust the market participants, the banks, the financial institutes, to take care and look after some interests that are not only economic ones? Can we trust the corporates to have this broader picture of having, for example, sustainable growth in our society? If it's possible, then I have in my own work, I have nothing against I call this market regulation. Basically letting the market participants to regulate issues in the financial markets on their own. And this is nothing new. You have traditions of self-regulation for quite a lot of time in many markets, not only in the US, but also in many European countries as well. What's important here, I think, is not only that we have either state regulation or only market regulation. We need to find this balance, the point of where it becomes not, suffocating the markets, but also making sure that these more common public interests, are ensured.
Mm-hmm. Well, can I then yes, sure, Professor Zeno.
Just one, I suppose you already have seen it, but I just would like to sort of share it with all the audience. I suppose you've seen Professor Vardi's book on the integration of European financial markets, which points out how in Europe, but not only in Europe, there's this network and its informal relations. And this goes very, very deep down into sort of micro transactions. I mean, just think of overnight, what happens, how you establish overnight transactions. So, I mean, I'm just pointing out to those who were interested in that. I've sent it to everybody, the link to the book, and it indicates how these aspects are done. Second point that I think it might be interested for you to develop is that if we look at the Bank of International Settlements, which is somehow the base in which the Financial Stability Board and the Basel Committee for Banking Regulation is set, it is a private company under Swiss law. It was established way back in, I think, 28 under Swiss law. And we find this mechanism by which these international financial institutions are based on private law. If we look at something much more recent, European Financial Stability Facility in Luxembourg, again, it is a company which is incorporated in Luxembourg, private company incorporated according to Luxembourg law, and with an arbitration clause in London. Just to point out that there's this interaction between sort of states are sort of private partners of companies which have a global governance role. So it is very complex from if we look at the ideas behind it. I think this is also a point that deserves analysis. And then finally, just to reply to Professor Somma, but this is somehow a duel that been going on for the last 30 years with Professor Somma. I mean, when we look at values, and if we really interested in looking at values in international financial markets, well, I think that maybe sort of if we look at we are forced to look, maybe we don't agree with what they do with the money, but if we look at the Islamic Development Bank, there the values are all there, that there's no speculation. There's all the whole notion of riba and how you don't take advantage with interest rates, but you are a partner, therefore you share risks, and therefore, so just to point out that, I mean, if we start looking at values, then we better look also at cultures that are different from our Western cultures and see how their idea of financial markets can be regulated. This wasn't a suggestion to you, but somehow a reply to my friend Professor Somma, who is here, and we will have this kind of debate.
Yes, okay. I'm very sympathetic with this intervention of Zeno, because I see the financial market as the most similar phenomenon to a spontaneous order. It is really a spontaneous order in IX too. And so it means that trillions of people are maintaining this order spontaneously. And it is I think it is very wrong to use torts, for instance, in these cases, or to promote the tort law in these cases, because you do not create incentives to people to be careful when it is signing a contract. Of course, people investing in financial markets, I mean normal people, must be careful of the fact that he's investing for gaining. I mean, all these financial markets are just promoted by the egoism of all the people in the world. It's just egoism. And they want to take their money back and to gain more. And that said, so I don't see any problem with values and financial markets. I see just values promoted by an old leftism trying to impose environmental protection beyond the wishes of the people. Why does environment not have a price? Of course, we are concerned with future generations. I'm very concerned about taxes, and taxes on inheritance. So I'm concerned with future generations. But patently, there are no incentives to be concerned about environment for future generations. This is a problem, I mean, not just of an elite or a clique of persons. It is the problem of billions of people in the world. Okay.
Yeah. I think can I just, if I may, just to, I'm not gonna. I think a lot of really interesting points, and it feels like you really got what I wanted to capture. This enormous complexity of different sources, how private rulemakers, how they can affect regulations and how they're connected to each other. So I think this was a really good forum for me to present my paper. And I think that just add a point there also that it is a matter of conflicts of interest. You will always have people that will pursue their own interests, their own economic interests. And that's the heart of, the problem of financial system, of this whole structure. And when it comes to environment, for example, it's not really about turning the financial sector so they no longer pursue their own economic interests, because then the whole financial sector would just, its core would collapse. It is more about how to, how to make the financial sector, create incentives for the financial sector to redirect the capital flows to promote sustainable. So it's this way. It's not about changing the nature of the financial sector, because I don't think it's possible either. But it's about redirecting, creating incentives, and trying to align interests. I'm also critical to whether it works or not, because I see the financial sector as much more, difficult than what it seems like at the surface. So I'm really grateful for all the comments and questions.
Okay. There is Professor O'Hare who asked to make a remark.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the presentation. And I'm very sorry that I couldn't really watch the slides because of the concussion. I thought it was super interesting. It's a topic I'm also very interested in. I actually come from a structured finance background, and I would certainly say I think regulation is quite important. I was curious as to know whether or not you would think of extending the research to sort of the values that then get transferred with multinational corporations, particularly those from non-Western backgrounds. Because in political science, certainly there's been an awful lot of work done on how values are transferred from multinational corporations, but those are always Western perspectives. And it's a debate I've had with political scientists who, for the most part, the ones I know certainly haven't really looked at how those norms and values might change through changing financial flows. So I was just wondering if you would, in the longer term, be thinking of extending that analysis.
Thank you so much for making this point, because I wanted to fit so much into this presentation, but it was only 20 minutes. I couldn't cover this. But one of the examples of the sources, the variety of sources, was, you know, multinational financial institutes. Can they spread norms across the world? What kind of impact do they have? I would love to, you know, to perhaps follow the multinational banks of China, for example, and see whether or not if it is possible for them to have an impact on different markets. It will be such an interesting work. It's so much that I want to do, but hopefully in the future, maybe.
Okay. So I'm sorry, but we have to go on. So it has been a very intriguing debate, and thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Now, I will give floor to Katharina SUZUKI-KLASEN of the Max Planck Institute from Hamburg. And the subject matter of her presentation is the classification of legal systems reconsidered. Please, you have floor.
Hello, thank you, Professor Montaneri. And I will also share my screen because I have a presentation which you can see. So good afternoon, buon pomeriggio, or as the case may be, good morning, buongiorno. So my name is Katharina SUZUKI-KLASEN, and I am a PhD student at the University of Hamburg in Germany, and actually a former research associate at the Max Planck Institute in Hamburg. Currently, I am a visiting fellow at the University of Pisa in Italy. And the focus of my research is comparative contract law. But today I will talk about a methodological matter, namely the classification of legal systems. So before into the topic, I want to address the question briefly of why we need to classify legal systems. I will then outline some influential ways of legal systems and then analyze how these categorizations work by determining the nature of English, German, and Japanese law. I will finish my presentation with some concluding remarks that will hopefully raise further discussion. So a natural question to ask is, why do we need to classify legal systems? And the simple answer is that law is a social science and as such uses scientific method. Now, I don't want to go into discussions of comparative methodology, but I rather point out that irrespective of the approach that is adopted, there are generally 3 steps to a comparative inquiry, as you can see on the slide. And part of the first step, the selection, is the choice of legal systems. Now, this selection of the legal systems is actually important because it will impact the result of the inquiry, in the sense that it can affect if so, how many differences or similarities are discovered. Now, the classification of the legal systems aids us in this selection process because it hints the degree of similarity or difference that exists between the laws. So with this in mind, let us look at three of the most influential ways of classifying legal systems. And it has actually been said that there are as many classifications as there are comparatives. And I didn't count, but I'm sure that however many approaches there actually are, I wouldn't be able to present them all in this webinar. So I have chosen these three approaches, namely the legal family system by René Davide, the division into Rechtskreise by Konrad Zweigert and Hein Kötz, and the approach advocated by Patrick Glenn to distinguish legal tradition. The first approach dates from the late 1960s, and René Davide classified legal families whereby the members of each family share general characteristics like the sources or structure of the legal system, as well as non-legal contexts such as the society, politics, and so on. Using these criteria, David found the three groups that you can see, namely Western law, socialist law, and other conceptions of law and social ordering. The Western family is divided into the common law family and the Romano-Germanic law family. Mixed jurisdictions, as for example South Africa, are also inside the Western law family. However, David did not actually create a subgroup for them. It should also be noted that according to David, only Western law and socialist law are legal families in the strict sense. And the group other conceptions of law, or rather its subgroups, namely religious law, Far East law, and Malagasy law, are better seen as associations because there are no interrelations between the members of these subgroups. The second classification was by Zweigert and Kötz, and it dates from the late 1970s. So their division into Rechtskreise is established on the basis of the system's legal style, the Rechtsstil. The distinctions that are made are actually a little bit finer than David's legal families. And the legal style is a result of the legal systems, legal histories, legal thought, concepts, and also the ideology. Zweigert and Kötz used these factors and actually split what David called the Western law family into four Rechtskreise, namely the Romanistic, the Germanic, the Nordic, and the Anglo-American legal systems. In addition, created the legal system for the Far East for religious laws. They didn't treat mixed systems explicitly. They suggested that such mixed systems ought to be integrated as possible into the same family as the mother law. This can, of course, be problematic if you have a mixed system with two or maybe even more strong mother laws. Finally, the third approach is from the year 2000, where Patrick Glenn advocated a way of classifying legal systems that stands apart from the previous two approaches, yet a consideration of the wider picture, namely the legal tradition as the formative influence in the law of all civilizations. While this notion seems different from legal families or Rechtskreise, The factors that Glenn used to discover the legal traditions are actually very similar, because they include the sources and structure of the law, institutions, and also the legal method. On this basis, Glenn describes 7 legal traditions, as you can see: Chthonic, normative or native societies, Talmudic of the Jewish people, Islamic, Hindu, Asian, which has recently been renamed Confucian, and then there are the well-known concepts of civil law and common law. After this very brief overview of these 3 ways of classifying legal systems, we see that in effect the categories within the 3 approaches are very similar. It seems more like the underlying philosophies are different. But the question is, what do these different categories mean in practice? To discover this, I will now classify England, Germany, and Japan. And when Plato is considered, I actually see that there are homogeneous results for all 3 legal systems. So English law is said to be of the common law or Anglo-American legal family or legal tradition, while Germany is said to belong to the Romano-Germanic or Germanic legal family, or is of civil law tradition. Now, the Japanese legal system has been described as belonging to the Far East legal system or to the Asian tradition. The question that I want to pose is, do these results reflect the true nature of the legal systems as they exist today, or do we need to reconsider the classification system? I actually add this with Japanese law in mind. I'm sure there are other examples that might apply. This is because, as we see, Japanese law here is labeled as a Far East or Asian tradition. But in fact, experts in Japanese law rather call the Japanese legal system mixed system, which I also think is perhaps more appropriate, as we will see. But in either case, a reconsideration of the general classification system might be warranted, because the classification systems that we date back a few years, and so the concepts might, at least in part, be perhaps a little outdated. Furthermore, comparatives have pointed out that the perspective taken can affect the result of the classification. So another question might be if a legal system will necessarily fall within the same legal family or tradition, even if, let's say, just one part of a system is considered. In order to assess the appropriateness of classification systems, I don't want to reinvent the wheel. I will adapt 2 perspectives and use 5 factors. The perspectives are to look at the system as a whole on the one hand, and to contrast this view by looking at a part, an area of law of the system on the other. The factors that I will use, we have already come across with the 3 approaches I just described, namely the sources of law, the structure of the legal system or the main areas of law, the non-legal context, and particular concepts or institution. I would only add one more factor, and this is the relationship a legal system has with other legal systems, in the sense that I want to ask what laws have been of influence in the legal system. And looking at the legal systems of England, Germany, and Japan as a whole, we see several points of similarity, but also of difference. So one point that is the same for all three systems is the non-legal context, because the legal systems are all embedded in capitalist secular democracies. Another point is similar is the laws that have been of influence. The EU, for example, and EU law has been influential in German law as it has in English law and continues to do so, but it has also inspired legislation even in Japanese law. Another idea or argument could be that Roman law has, whether directly or indirectly, influenced German, English, and even Japanese law in the past. What sets Japanese law a little bit apart in this respect is that the Japanese legal system has actually experienced influence from a whole range of legal systems. The most formative laws are undoubtedly French, German, and US law, although Chinese law has historical importance and English law has also contributed to some legal changes. Now, the points of greatest divergence are found in the sources of law and in the structure of the law. So, as is probably known, English law is true to its tradition in that case law is the primary source of law, while legislation is only of secondary importance, traditionally. And in German law, the reverse is true, same in Japanese law, because here legislation is the legal basis and court decisions are only usually a mere tool of interpretation. We also see an assimilation between German and Japanese law in terms of the structure of law. So the general structure of law is actually very similar between the two. And just taking one example, so contract law is part of or a sub-area of the law of obligations in both German and Japanese law. Now, the English legal doesn't know of a law of obligations as such. Rather, there are several fields of law, of which contract law is one, that are of rank. So contract law stands beside, for example, commercial law or property law. If we take all these factors together, we see that English law should belong to the common law legal family, while German law should belong to the Germanic or civil law family. Now, Japanese law, I have put down here not to belong to the Far East or Asian family, but as a mixed system, because there have been influences from both civil and common law, though arguably the civil law influence has overall been stronger. Now, the question is if this classification holds true when consider only individual areas of law. And one field that I would like to highlight is contract law. But actually here we see that the result of the classification would be the same. So English law is still common law, German law is still Germanic or civil law, and Japanese law again is a mixed system. Now, how about if we consider a different area of law, for example, contract law? Here, consumer law, sorry. Here, the picture changes. This is because for the European countries, the European Union has had considerable influence in this area, which means that, in fact, legislation has become the main source of consumer law. And even this is even true for English law. For Japanese law, nothing changes. Here too, legislation is the main source of law. What is different is the so in German law, consumer has integrated into the German Civil Code, but in English law, we have also seen a comprehensive act being enacted in 2015. This is the Consumer Rights Act that bundled together most, although not all, of the English consumer law. In contrast, in Japan, the consumer law regulation has not been integrated into the Civil Code, but here we find a range of scattered pieces of legislation, similar a bit to the situation we had in England prior to 2015. Now, in this respect, looking at the structure, one might ask if English law, English consumer law, is still truly common law because of the form of consumer law, which here is in form of a legislation, and also because of the content, which is, let's say, European or EU driven. Now, even if that were true, so if we add areas of law, which I won't do due to time constraints, we might see that there are other results for the other laws as well. What this might lead to is that we see one legal system actually ending up a mixed system, because individual areas of law have different weightings, shall I say, in terms of its influence or nature. If this happened, then the whole systemization or classification of legal systems would become, I don't want to say useless, but not very helpful. So I'd say it might be better to look at the overall picture instead of focusing on a part of law, although it might be good to keep in mind that certain areas of law might have different weightings.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Are you over, or you? No, sorry,
yes,
sorry.
just
Sorry. Yes.
just very brief concluding remarks. So and their results. There has been differentiation between funding. I request
Dr. Suzuki, we can't hear you. Sorry very much. Oh. We've lost you. We haven't heard your conclusions. Sorry.
I'm sorry. Can you hear me again?
Now, yes, we can.
Okay, sorry. So what I wanted to say at the end was we have seen a differentiation, increasing differentiation in the different classification methods. But I wonder if this is enough, and if we need to maybe differentiate more and consider laws that have been perhaps marginalized until now, like those of Asia, of Latin America, the Middle East, or Africa. And in this sense, I would like the following question. How is your legal system classified? And do you agree with the classification, or do you think it might have to be classified differently? So thank you very much for your attention. Grazie per l'attenzione. And thank you also very much to the organizers for reorganizing everything and making us able to have these webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. So we have a couple of minutes for debating your report. Thank you. Well, there are questions, remarks? Okay, can I start then? Because I think that anyway, your topic is of outstanding importance. Well, I would say it is not so surprising that the result is the same among various authors, as long as English law is considered an example of the common law tradition, or that Germany is an example of Roman law, that Japan is included in categories so vast as East Asia. As long as we know that Japan lies in East Asia, and I think that Glenn and the Germans and the French can but agree on this point. I would focus, as you were trying to do, just on one aspect of a legal system, for example, contract. Yeah, you did mention contract, but with an unusual, and I start to find a rather annoying attention to consumer contracts. Of course, we know there are consumer contracts, we know it is important, but the theory of contract is the hard code of law contract.
Yes.
Well, from this standpoint, it is intriguing because the French model of the contract was rather opposite to the German one. Because now things are changing rapidly because of the disparition of the cause de l'obligation. But we are still unaware of what the French courts will do with the residues of codes. So this is a clear example where two Romanist systems diverged completely on the theory of contract. But anyway, the contract of English law was absolutely different for its lexicon, its basic tenets, and especially considering the domains of bailment, covenant, deeds, and so on. So how we have to cope with these strange varieties or sharp differences among Romanist systems, and anyway, the fact that the common law word is built on totally different bricks. That's just a very simple and basic question confronted with by so many authors in classification of legal systems.
Sorry, what was the...
My remark is, what's your point on these matters, I mean?
Yes, thank you very much for this remark. Well, actually, contract law is my area of expertise, and I prefer basic consumer law, contract law. I just put in consumer law as a sort of reverse example, although maybe it wasn't the best example, I admit. But I agree with you that the diversity and the basic contract theory that we see, of course, within Europe, I also have of Japanese, even perhaps globally, is very interesting. And it is a challenge, I think, to I don't want to say harmonize, but to as you say, deal with differences, in particular between, I mean, you mentioned, unfortunately, I don't have much knowledge of the French system, although I do know they had the cause until recently, but now they've gotten rid of it. Whereas in English law, of course, you have consideration, which is also seen as something very unique, shall we say, and to put these concepts together and to I think is very challenging, especially if you have systems like German law, for example, which has neither something like consideration or cause, and this is actually yes, very interesting, I think.
All right, all right. Okay, there are someone other remarks, or otherwise we can move on.
C'è il professor Somma che vuole intervenire. Se guardi,
yes.
se guardi le manine alzate, vedi che ci sono le manine alzate sulla.
Ok, Somma, please.
Anche la manina alzata di Vincenzo.
Sì, dove si vedono queste manine alzate?
Devi andare devi andare su participants.
Q&A? Ah, su participants. Ok.
Vedi panelist.
Okay.
So I have a general remark and a question.
Yes.
The general remark is on the approach of Patrick Glenn. I would stress the difference between his approach and the approach of René David and Zeiger and Kurtz. Because indeed, Zeiger and Kurtz and David, they classify legal systems, meaning by that national legal systems. Whereas the idea of legal tradition is a way to overcome this state dimension. And this is something which is really important. For example, also this classification of Professor Monateri stresses the idea that one has to overcome the state dimension. This was the remark. Now the question. You probably know that there is much critique on the idea of classifying from a specific point of view, that classification and the analogical approach is not able to catch the movement. It's a static point of view over legal systems. Whereas in order to catch the movement, to explain legal change, one should have a genealogical approach. And that would be the main critique in the recent debates against the idea of classification. Did you reflect on that point? Is it true for you that classification is not able to catch the movement, to explain legal change in some way?
Yeah, thank you very much for your remark that I will, well, I agree with you. I'm sorry, I didn't properly reflect this, but I was aware that, of course, there is national laws on the one hand, which were classified by David and Scott and Kurtz and Glenn, who were something larger, shall we say. As to your question about the development of laws, I agree in the sense that the systems that we see, so for example, René David's system, is of course old compared to Glenn's system. And if these systems aren't perhaps renewed, the question is because of course systems changes, but the question is, can this be reflected? I mean, one idea might be to have like a classification system which is updated time and again to reflect legal changes. But the question is how fine of a change should be reflected in these systems. I mean, one point that will probably become a topic in the future, I'm not sure how much for classification, but in general, of course, is the Great Britain leaving as a member of the EU. This will have implications for the law, of course, though we don't know at this point how soon or much, because we don't know what English law will do, basically, if it will get rid of basically European law or keep it, or for how long. But this is one example, perhaps, one change that could happen in the future, even here within. And this is actually also something that I was thinking of when I posed this question also to myself. Do we need to reconsider the classification systems? Because, so coming back, yes, I think perhaps there should be some way to reflect changes in legal developments. But to be honest, I'm not entirely how this be done without perhaps making the system too complicated.
Okay, Professor Zeno?
Yes, I'm Dr. SUZUKI-KLASEN. I apologize, but I share practically nothing of what you've said, apart from the last final remarks on the sort of reconsidering. I think that this classification that you have presented is the sort of the inheritance of early sort of late 19th century, beginning 20th century classification, which is focused on private law and nothing else, and private law is marginalized in legal systems. But I just sort of, I obviously thank God we are free to have very different views, but if you sort of want to wish to see some destructive views of legal systems, I will just so you can reconstruct it as you must, if you want to reconstruct it. So you see someone who's coming there with a bulldozer and trying to throw everything down, and so you can reconstruct it. I'll just send you the final conclusions of my handbook on comparative legal systems, in which I express, it's online, it's open access, so it's easily, and sort of with some ideas on why the classification, whether it's René David or my handbook, my basic handbook, it's Zweigert-Kurz. I've grown on Zweigert-Kurz, so I mean, that is a monument for me. So I mean, but now in the 21st century seem to me quite outdated, but this is my very personal view. So I'm not asking you for a reply, I'm just saying that you will find also someone who's there to trying to destroy what you are trying to build.
That is completely fine. I am always grateful for constructive, well, I hope it is constructive criticism. Yes, thank you very much. I will gladly have a look at what you've written and try to incorporate it in the paper. Well, there might be something to gain and maybe some way to save a classification system in some way. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much. We must proceed now, and I give floor to the next speaker, Vanessa Villanova-COLLAO, the University of Illinois, on empirical methods in comparative law. Can you hear me? Are you?
I can hear you perfectly fine.
Okay. Professor Villanova-COLLAO, University of Illinois, on empirical law.
Sorry, I lost you. Abbiamo perso, non ti sentiamo più.
Okay, maybe, yeah.
Yeah, you can start anyway. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I shall try to fix my connection.
It's perfectly fine. So good afternoon or good morning. I would like, first of all, thank you for the introduction, Professor Monateri. I would like to thank the organizers in building this series of webinars, and it's a great pleasure to be here. In this presentation, I will explain different methodologies that were vastly applied in social sciences but timidly advanced in law, and how comparative law will benefit from the scientific method. So the first question is, why does a legal scholar need empirical studies? So legal research that revolves into methods that are outside of the law tends to be more sophisticated. But until that, the solution be handled by a jurist, someone who can make a harmonious interpretation between data and theory. More than 20 years ago, the only inferential statistics that were applied to law and only in the corporate sector were econometrics, which is, as you may see, mathematical analysis, which was congenial to quantitative research, pointing out to a definite numerical number, to a definite numerical result, somewhat causal, but left inconclusive other questions that pertain to law, such as policy. So what kind of questions can we answer? The answers that we can have for empirical methods are limited. We can answer composition questions, such as what are the formats of a specific legal system, relationship between institutions, descriptive and causal questions. However, pure quantitative methods will not be named when answering non-causal questions, such as the understanding of a legal system, categorizations of rules, or even harmonization. In any event, these methods are a good source for understanding the real world, challenging assumptions rather than merely recurring to speculation, and in most cases, purely intuition. Empirical comparative studies emerge as a subsection of empirical legal studies, which its main feature resides in cross-country data, and data I'm referring here to formal materials, theories, people, algorithms. And here I turn back to the experience that arose from the Law and Society movement, allowing jurists to explore different methodologies that were focused on the study of anthropology, sociology, psychology, and so on. But with a rigorous method and in theory, that separated the normative or prescriptive from the descriptive ones. Indeed, the methods that are applied by Law and Society scholars go beyond social sciences and conventional authorities, identifying the law as a human construct that changes and varies according to the conditions of the culture in which it is embedded. In that sense, the law is not merely pragmatical, rational, or instrumental, because people do not regularly think about legal concepts when thinking about the law, but they merge it with values. Hence, these studies are non-normative studies to uncover legal problems. Comparative studies, though, shed light on the constant connection between law and culture, but its objectivity was grounded on the study of the behavior of a specific group, which was the legal elite. For some time, the rise of the law and economics, with the rise of the law and economics, the legal field was captured by the application of rational choice theory, borrowed from economic studies, depicting these unrealistic individuals trying with this constant desire to maximize utility. And rational choice theory and ability to mirror concrete scenarios initially moved legal scholars to a sort of skepticism. But without an approach that was separated from law, those critics were unsuccessful. Eventually, they surrendered to this method. However, significant critics came from psychology. And it was only by using cognitive studies that it was possible to understand how people made choices, and those choices were far from what rational choice theory indicated. The methods that psychologists used in their reasoning were grounded on laboratory experiments, and law and economics was extraneous to the use of any rigorous studying and having some control group or device, because law and economics is merely blind to culture and context. Indeed, what economists are taught is to make assumptions, and sometimes those assumptions made on some social context might reveal false or inaccurate. And indeed, choices are part of human behavior, and it's by understanding those choices that we can reach better predictions, or at least accurate ones. What these experiments explained was that the so-called Homo economicus does not mirror a selfish and unbounded individual searching for utility maximization, but an individual that ponders choices according to the conditions, to the surrounding circumstances. In most cases, we are guided by fairness, and namely, he or she acts within bounded self-interest. The scientific method stems from observation. which is not uncommon in comparative law. And here's the steps in empirical research. So the first step is identifying a topic. And for our purposes, it's a cross-country area that embraces unsolved questions of law and reviewing the existing literature or theories that we want to apply. This doesn't mean that we do not normally do this for non-empirical research, but here the scope is different. Literature review activity will aid not only in identifying the gaps in the law not yet developed, but to invoke the ones that tend to produce most observable implications and to extract as many implications as possible. Only then we will be able to elaborate a plan on how to observe those implications. In other words, why do we care about the study? What is the contribution of the legal knowledge? The second step is developing the research question, or better said, the hypothesis, and that can enable us to theorize or speculate about its answer. There is not a single way in which the study can point and the research question can point. It can, of course, involve an innovative question or that no other scholar has advanced, or take a unique approach to an old question, but it can also address prior studies giving conflicting responses or update the study by introducing new data and taking the advantage of technological developments that were not available during the original study. The third step is the hypothesis testing. So we want to test those predictions or outcomes that we expect to see in this situation. And those outcomes include the characteristics of a phenomenon. If the research question could be explained by an equation, it will be composed by independent variables or the outcomes, events, or predictions, and the dependent variables, which is the content of that outcome that we will try to explain. From the identification of those variables follows an important step, which is measurement, comparing the object of a study with a standard. And here now I will explain some of the methodologies that are used now in law. The first one is randomized controlled trials. These are called also the gold standard of empirical research. And these kinds of experiments assign randomly cases, people, judges, or units to different conditions. And after careful observation, the one receiving treatment, we will be able to see whether this experimental group, which is the one that is receiving treatment, will react differently from the control group, which is the one that is not receiving treatment and basically controlling for that added variable. After measuring both and comparing both randomly assigned groups, it will highlight the differences between them, whether those are tied to the desired outcome or are based on an alternative explanation. Its application has been useful to understand how decision makers, judges, and jurors resolve issues regarding risk assessment, juror instructions, juror questioning witnesses, and so forth. Law psychology also provides some interesting reflections into liability, being both centers in the same question on how do people decide toward compensation and punishment. And so some psychological experiments show how fact finders' decisions are affected by heuristics, which is the same to say cognitive biases, finding people overall discomfort when dealing with all or nothing situations in tort liability. The results of these studies were consistent with observations from the real world. And here is a study that assessed a study of 1,000 10,000 negligence lawsuits that purpose to test the comparative negligence in its two variations, pure and partial or modified comparative negligence. Pure comparative negligence is the standard of negligence where there is a reduction of recovery consistent to plaintiff percentage of responsibility, and partial or modified comparative negligence is the standard that has established threshold of liability on plaintiff that will bar recovery, and it's either that threshold is either 50% or 51%, depending on the state. So the results offer a twisted mechanism in which fact finders awarded plaintiff recovery. And in pure comparative negligence, 22% of fact finders found plaintiff responsibility above 50%. As in partial or modified comparative negligence, fact finders found only 7.5% of the cases, plaintiff's responsibility that was higher than 50%. And this divergence was also palpable when assigning unusual percentages, 49 when the threshold is 50 or 50 when the threshold is 51, implying that they granted recovery otherwise barred based on moral judgments or fairness, sometimes overcompensating victims or providing evidence of jury manipulation. Comparatives can use law and psychology studies to bring out issues with those standards in different legal systems. Network analysis, and this I think it will be beneficial for our first panelist, is another technique that used to shed light on small-scale interactions between individuals and their influence of the information, as well as community development. So those studies are centered in sociological methodology, identifying the interactions between actors, that could be people, judges, things, algorithms, documents, and their connection with ties, which are linkage, normally friendship, working or exchange relationships, and the network, which is all the actors and ties in the population. To understand the relationship between non-primary groups in a given social structure. So the central idea behind this type of methodology is that those to whom our relationship is weak, that are centered in the peripheral part of our network, that are the weak ties, evolve in different contexts and thus have access to different information that's more varied, and in a lot of cases it's useful information because the quality is higher. One of its applications is in the study of agencies, such as the United States Securities and Exchange Commission, and their network interactions in advancing enforcement. And here I present a study of SEC gratitude acknowledgements in press releases and the type of cooperation in investigations. So the study confirmed one thing, that SEC has continued having collaboration with formal institutions and sub-regulatory organizations, but in pursuing enforcement, but uncovered the prominent role of US postal inspectors. This is an unexpected actor. As a result, the current enforcement mechanism of the securities will be enhanced by implementing its task force, especially establishing connections on those weak ties to identify and uncover suspect behavior that were initially not otherwise discoverable. And these studies could also reveal useful in a hot topic nowadays in comparative law, comparative whistleblower regulations. We can see how this network analysis of agencies in the US or Europe may make emerge different actors that can have valuable information. A recurrent technique in empirical legal studies is regression analysis. This is a technique borrowed from economists, and their language has been part of our daily basis parlance. We tend to say that two things are correlated to show somewhat comparison, although correlation involves more than that. And this is a preliminary study I did for my program, and the question was whether know your customer practices affect the success of the initial client offering process and could lead to refraining investment and innovation. So what are know your customer? Those are due diligence procedures applied to financial institutions or market participants such as brokers, dealers, to deter criminals looking to hide ill-gotten proceeds. So those criminals that want to have access to the financial system anonymously. The practices of handling KYC due diligence procedures creates a cost of handling and collecting information for companies. On the other hand, ICOs, or initial client offerings, are those vehicles for funding startups that use smart contracts. So they are founded in blockchain technology and distributed ledger technology, which, as you may know, it's a fairly mainly unregulated world. It's a virtual world where anonymity is a desired feature. So there was conflicting information about how these practices created a negative effect on ICOs. So the cost of doing business and the cost of going public. Thus, I started to look to the components of a successful ICO. First of all, defining what is ICO success. And I define it as the minimum amount of money raised to finance their startups. And these are the factors. such as promoting using virtual exchanges, the whitelist or the list of trusted investors, the minimum investment required, which is something that we see in IPOs normally when they want to reduce the number of investors in order to avoid securities regulations impositions, and regulation on the transfer of asset holders between buyers. So we're dealing with secondary markets. This is my hypothesis that can be explained through an equation, and this is the equation. So on one hand, you see the ICO success, which is the outcome, whether I want to predict, which is the dependent variable, the constant that holds for alternative possible explanations, the factors, which is the content, and the error rate. Only the regression analysis can show the relationship between different types of categorical variables, allowing us to measure also the strength of the relationship. And here what you see are the results of reporting, my results reporting the odds ratio of the occurrence of the event, and read here the probability of seeing these variables in a successful ICO, and the standard errors between parentheses. If we find that there is statistical significance equal or higher than 5%, which is an arbitrary measure, then we can reject immediately the null hypothesis of no association between these two variables, and which is more or less the same to say that there is a true relationship that exists between them. So the results showed other type of relationships, that ICOs are successful when there are also virtual exchanges and where there is tax regulation in ICO transfer. What are my implications from this result? So, my implications are that in this decentralized world where it lacks reputational renters and here read intermediaries, the only way to signal market integrity and transparency was by exacting market information from potential asset holders. So this tells us that regulation and corporate due diligence does not negatively affect the capital structure of crypto assets. So there are some limitations in empirical research. The profound difference between law and other areas is that jurors are asked to solve problems or to deliver, often giving solutions that are contingent to time, so thinking fast. Conversely, empirical studies do not provide a definite answer, but they are cumulative in their works. But it's still hard work, it's crabby work, outside of the realm of law, potentially value-free. Some of these methodologies are powerful tools in providing answers to specific legal questions, but might not be innate for all legal questions. Writing surveys demand a detail-oriented work in framing questions to avoid influencing participants, and these questions might be standardized. The added hurdle that that comparatives have is that we are dealing with multilingual cross-country participants. Hence, standardization of questions also carries standardization of language. Furthermore, it's a good habit not to immediately draw inferences from the results of lab experiments, because those results can have other alternative or rival explanations not initially envisioned. This led us to state a caveat on empirical causative studies, which fundamental problem resides always in certainty. So those studies require factual information. So a legislation is either enacted or not, but we cannot revert the process. Indeed, empirical analysis is framed in terms of association, relationship, correlation between variables. Even in randomized controlled trials, it would not be possible to answer why or how some factors produce that result. And this poses another question, another issue, that is replication. In empirical research, transparency is always needed. Partially, the candor and the validity of a study is achieved through replication by others. Only then we can generalize a concept. However, replication is less favored and considered less prestigious by legal scholars that prefer theory or models. And this type of research has also a great cost in learning, especially for those scholars who do not have prior statistical training, but also it purports also the cost of doing research. Some research are very expensive, they require funding, and are long to complete. However, there are new technological advancements. The Amazon Mechanical Turk, or MTurk, is a software that provides a vast audience of online participants that can lower the cost without diminishing its value. There is a lack of legally oriented data sets ready to consume. This could put the bar too high in finding sources in a different system. There are open databases such as the Inter-University Consortium for Political Science and Social Sciences, which is held by the University of Michigan, that maintains and updates an impressive number of data sets. And at the current moment, there are 10 countries that use their data. Those can reduce the cost of doing research, but has not diminished the cost of doing comparative empirical research. So the message of this presentation is not to urge you to apply empirical methods. These methods require rigorous procedures, study, and preparation, but they provide evidence capable to correct false understanding of a substantive area of the law with extrinsic methods. The most difficult part, though, is reconciling this type of methodology with the law. And this can be done through the analysis, which is the most important part. We are talking of legal paper every time we are using those type of extrinsic methodologies. So what does this study give us? What are the legal implications? What are the theories or concepts that we want to test or define? There is in the US an increasing interest in empirical legal studies that has intensified many law schools to equip their students with an understanding of these tools, and more importantly, to make them informed readers. Probably this will be a distinctive feature for future generations of scholars, lawyers, and judges that will be able to communicate to a variety of audiences the relevance of, let's say, expert testimony, or to engage in the empirical debate. But for that, we need to raise awareness of the preservation of cross-country data, cross-country legal data. Without that, no comparative empirical study will be possible. And now I'm more than happy to answer any questions, comments, or fears from this presentation. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your very fine presentation. And so I give floor to whatever want to make a remark. Question? Well, so I can start just with a question. So I very appreciate empirical legal studies, but I think, and I want your opinion on this, if there is also a wider possibility for quantitative analysis beyond empirical researches. I mean, for instance, I make an example, what Franco Moretti did for comparative literature, a quantitative analysis of text, for instance. So how many times really paradigm against CHEN is yet cited by courts? What is the real canon according to text and so forth? So, of course, I understand the importance of empirical legal researches, and I do think that anyway, there is a wider scope for quantitative analysis in comparative law. Do you agree?
So yeah, there are different, I just gave a glimpse of what are the most used techniques here in the US, but there are other techniques such as text analysis, which is something that I'm using, that it's quite different than the regression analysis. It's good, although it's subject to a lot of criticism, because only through regression we can have, the degree of certainty is higher. So many courts have adopted regression analysis coupled with other values in order to understand that statistically significant does not equate importance. So many courts have dealt with the issues of materiality in disclosures of information, and that can be proved by regression, but it's not enough. We need to associate probability plus the magnitude of the information that we are disclosing. And this is just a parenthesis for the securities market, which I'm working. On the other hand, I think that other techniques are valuable, but just looking at the median mode, looking at percentage raw data, it's more associated with playing with numbers, because we can draw inferences that are completely wrong. So that's why regression analysis is so important and so focused nowadays in the US. Although it's not the only type of empirical research, and I'm using text analysis because I do think that there's a validity on that, and I would like to share now another type of empirical technique that it's very trendy in my area of research. I can find it. So yeah.
Okay. Professor Zeno.
Dr. Villanueva COLLAO, I really appreciate very much your speech and it's your presentation, and it's very important that the young scholars are multidisciplinary and manage to work on different fields, still remaining lawyers. We must never forget that we are lawyers, and we are trying to learn other techniques to increase our knowledge and our common knowledge of the law. So this is just congratulations for your speech. I just wanted to point out that you are aware, but just as I'm just mentioning this for everybody else, just that in Matthias Sims' comparative law handbook, there's a whole chapter on numerical comparative law, in which he does the use of sort of numbers data in comparative law. It's just one of the perspectives that you pointed out that I think should be shared by the community, and this is the occasion to share this knowledge.
Thank you, Professor, for your insight, and I think I will be briefly what you just mentioned, the paper. I don't realize it was a paper or a book, because if it was a paper,
it's a handbook. It's Matthias Sims, Professor Sims' handbook, comparative law, 2nd edition, Cambridge University Press, 2018.
Okay. So the problem with there are different types of regressions. The more appropriate ones, and the one that it's more sophisticated and more hard, is the logistic regression, because when we are talking about law, we have variables and we have scenarios that are widely complex, so we cannot even use linear or basic regression models for that. They won't tell us anything. It's not that regression analysis tells you what you have to think, how can you elaborate a theory of law. It won't. I would like to point out another type of empirical research, because it's an intersection between engineering and the law with smart contracts, which is what I'm working on. It's basically showing how a contract works in blockchain. So it deals more with applied cryptography. So it does not involve any statistical methodology for now. It's only disclosing the information that was hidden by the applied cryptography.
Okay. Antonello Miranda, please.
I'm sorry, but I'm a little bit skeptical for the application of empirical methodology to the law studies, because I think you need some method that is good for all the areas of law, and I wonder if the empirical methodology may be applied to family law, for instance, where people sometimes make some very unpredictable should choose. That's it.
Okay, please.
So one thing that law and society, and I think psychologists agreed, is that we cannot predict human behavior. It's impossible. So what we try to say is, how can we have an accurate prediction of something that will happen in the future? Although this is only given by our blurred perception of time, because there is no cause on effect, and this is stems from this concept in physics. Empirical studies are good for some questions, would not be innate for everything. You normally see comparative legal studies in constitutional law, in elder law, which is a new trend now in the US. You see also the securities market, and in there is one empirical study that I really appreciated, because I saw many scholars around the world and also in Italy engaging in this debate of empirical, of the Twombly and Iqbal which were two twin judgments of the Supreme Court of the United States that heightened the pleading standard in civil procedure. We're talking about pleading standard in civil procedure. And so when they heightened this standard, there was a massive amount of papers that says, well, now it's going to create a chilling effect. Many people would not have access because they don't have access to great lawyers. It will create, it will favor only one part of the potential defendants, which are corporations. And so there was the 3-year empirical study that showed that the trend of the filings in lawsuits at the Supreme Court after Twombly and Iqbal did not change. So it remained invariant. So all these speculations about it's going to refrain access to justice and etc. were not supported by real world data. So it was not evident. What an empirical legal scholar will ask me is whether we have the same demographics as before. This is a question that has not been raised. And that's only to tell you that there is a higher standard. We can reach excellent evidence-based theories from empirical methods, but they have to be constantly tested. So it's not in any case, it's not a definite answer. It's a debate. We have to continue working on how to test these theories in the future.
Okay, thank you so much. No other interventions. Okay, so I give floor then to Davide Giacomo ZOPPOLATO of the University of Macerata, who is going to speak about legal transplants under the Belt and the Road Initiative. Please, you have floor.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for the organization of the conference. I'm going to share my screen. I prepared a short presentation. My presentation is going to deal with China, even for my academic background, because I spent much time in China, and because of my interest and my PhD. This presentation is part of my PhD that is dealing on the role of the Communist Party of China in shaping the national legal system. I will give a brief introduction on China, and then I will assess the role of globalization and legal transplant and the importance of this concept since the 90s. And then we will see how the Belt and Road Initiative is going to be the first comprehensive initiative from China that is involving somehow and in some limited aspects legal transplant. So we are all aware that China is a rising actor, and since its establishment embarked in extensive economic legal reforms, and since the very start, since the modernization period at the end of the 19th century, China relied on Western expertise during the Westernization process, but create a unique path to economic and legal development, and try to preserve and maintain some core characteristics that are considered like the Chinese foundation in traditional Chinese thinking. We, as the second contribution to this conference discussed, we are well aware that René Davide classified China as not a proper legal family and noted that law played a minor role and its function in East Asia was subsidiary. It's interesting to note that the core characteristic of today China found their roots during the Republican period, and thanks to dissemination and cross-dissemination and transplantation of some institutions also from the Soviet Union. For example, the one-party dictatorship was already present during the Republican period and during the period of political tutelage. But for the Communist Party of China, law is an essential tool to govern and lead the society and the economic and social development of the society. We noticed that during the Cultural Revolution, a predominance of informalism over formalism, and law was relegated to a secondary position into the Chinese society, even in light of the Marxist conception of law as an abusive tool in the end of the bourgeoisie. But for Deng Xiaoping, there was a change in the perspective of the use of law to create and regulate the socialist market economy and the socialist rule of law with Chinese characteristics. It is also important when we address China as a case study, as a country, to understand the supremacy of the Communist Party of China over the legal order in the country. Even in light of the latest round of the constitutional reform in 2018, when the amended Article 1 notes that the leadership of the Communist Party of China is the defining feature of the socialism with Chinese characteristics. We are aware that like the legal transplants in the country were kind of rejected or adapted according to national circumstances. For example, like the concept of rule of law is now a central and key element of party ideology, but was translated more in order to allow like the control of the bureaucracy by the Politburo of the Communist Party of China. In the same way, like corporate governance and the modernization of corporate governance in the country try to introduce some corporate governance mechanism, such as like the board of directors and supervisor and shareholder general meetings. But these three committees need to consider also that other committees have a leading role, especially in state-owned enterprises in China. For example, like the party committee. And often these two separate committees overlap between each other, and it's difficult like to get a result. The Belt and Road Initiative, as I told before, is the first comprehensive attempt of China to translating somehow its model on neighboring countries that are more aligned with China for like territorial proximity, ideology, and politics and economics. So let's briefly mention like to the interaction between globalization and legal transplant. I'm going to give it for granted the concept of legal transplant. And it's interesting that is a conceptual tool developed in order to explain legal developments and reforms. And even if was really criticized after the publication of the book of Alan Watson, a lot of like authors discussed in details this concept and try to, especially in doing the globalization, try to give and bring fresh air to this concept. And thanks to globalization, we have like a academic debate that shifted perspective. The initial focus was on legal history, but now before in the 90s, it changed to check and assist transitioning economies. And now there is more focused on economic development, financial and investment and trade and investment law. I suggest, based on Porter, like a division of the globalization phenomena in three stages. The first one, like the old traditional globalization built on like multilateral institution and on the need to removing barriers to trading goods. Legal reforms in this context were mostly carried out by at a multilateral level by global governance institution. And the focus on goods means also that the intervention in national legal system was less than in the next phase of the globalization process. But the rule of law narrative and legal transplant was important like for the colonization process, especially in order like to help with foreign experts the development of national constitutional and civil code in former colonies. The second stage was opened like in the 90s and noticed an increase and a boom in foreign direct investment, and the diffusion of law was also carried out by new actors such as like multinational corporations that also interfere with national regulation in order to unify and guarantee uniform code of conduct for their operation, for their suppliers, and also by leveraging on their contractual position when investing in developing and least developing countries. also, the role of cooperation is also interesting in order to see that legal assistance and development projects started to happen, even in order to help to better organize the regulatory framework for cooperation acting in this area. And some scholars call this period like a new era of codification that was funded by multilateral and regional organizations in order to create a more solid and robust protection of investment. Because if the first and all the globalization was basically like for liberalizing trading goods, the second one was on investment. And so they need to make amendment to the national legal framework to protect and guarantee investment. There are, of course, conflicts in a partial codification of a legal system, especially when they focus only on corporate law, as it happened in China during the 90s with the enactment of the company law. And also there are conflicts that are connected with language, because the diffusion of English as the global business language in some cases did not help in clarify the law, and in some other cases have the effect of further misunderstanding between different countries and emptying of content key notion. For instance, like the concept of rule of law, as I discussed briefly before, was applied and transplanted in China is in a complete different manner. And also there is another problem in China and in East Asia, that the intellectual elite and the languages is not helping like the dissemination and the creation of an acquis communautaire like in Europe, because the languages are completely different. Some are non-alphabetic like Chinese, and the students in East Asia tends to favor to study like in European or in European countries or in the United States. So they're maybe much more good in understanding like American law than Japanese law. And also the organizations that are working like in the area are focused on national security issues, for example, like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We are now entering, like after the financial crisis, we enter in a new phase of globalization and losing interest in multilateral cooperation, where we see also the rise of new actors that are now becoming and trying to transplanting like possible alternative model of legal and economic development. And the objective of this research is to try to understand if China is now trying to becoming like a plausible rival for legal transplant and create a formal legal system. The Belt and Road Initiative, I will just give a short overview, is this new initiative launched already in 2013, but that gained much attention like during the past 5 years, that China wants to connect the Europe and Asia via a terrestrial and a maritime line and route. In order to do so, is investing much in infrastructure connectivity. That is a relevant problem, especially in Central Asia, and is trying to promoting like a different model of economic integration that is based also on some foreign policy characteristic of the country. We have like different like priorities for the Chinese government in developing this initiative, and in implementing this initiative, we can see like a blueprint of the connection, but the initiative is open to all the willing partners. There are specific plans also for Latin American and Caribbean and Antarctica region. China is only the initiator of the BRI, and is trying to bring up like peaceful development and economic cooperation. But let's see like more in details, like 3 main principles arise in the Belt and Road Initiative that are like policy coordination, facilities connectivity, and unimpeded trade. That is some sort of slight variation of the concept of free trade, because the actual need of the world economy is like to facilitate trading goods. as signaled by the recently negotiated trade facilitation agreement under the World Trade Organization. But so, if China is trying to provide a model for transplantation based on its core characteristic to other countries, we need to understand if the reception is happening or not, and if there is some variation to the classic Western model of legal transplant. I just selected like two short case studies. One is the cybersecurity law enacted in Vietnam in 2019 that was based on the Chinese cybersecurity law. We can find much point of contact between the two pieces of legislation regarding the scope, and also the narrative and the rhetorics to protect national security and preserving the order and security of the cyberspace. In addition, there are also similar data localization and collection requirements in both law. They need to store a network's log in the country internally. And then there is like the most debated section that is like the possibility of censor and filter non-sensitive information. And then there is the concept of critical infrastructure and a pronounced role of the Ministry of Public Security. Another example is the concept of special economic zones that was actually transplanted in China, but then China adapted this with a kind of selective adaptation and is now transplanted in Pakistan and in other regions under the Belt and Road Initiative. Also in order to facilitate trade and the passage of goods coming from China and directed to Europe. I analyzed two separate regulations, a Chinese one that was the one that established the special economic zone in Guangdong province in 1980. That was like the center of the opening up reform of Deng Xiaoping, and one that took place in Pakistan a few years ago. And there are similarities, even in this case, about the authority in charge of the administration of the special economic zone that widely differ from other economic zones that exist, like in Europe, for instance. And there is also like a different preferential treatment for investors, both in taxation and on the use and the lease of public owned land. And also the approval commit is based at a provincial level, like in the Guangdong example. So I will like just sum it up like some preliminary conclusion and the decision to focus on the factors of legal change, that the main factors that have been identified by the literature. I just listed like the three main factors was like imposition, prestige, and efficiency. With this research, I'm trying to understanding if the Chinese legal transplant are following like this factor of legal changes or not. And I believe that in some cases we can reach like some preliminary and tentative conclusion that adhesion took the place of imposition, even like for the tendency of China or cooperating with even very diverse countries. And then instead of the focus of efficiency of the legal system, we have the focus on national security, as in the case of the cybersecurity law. And then there is like this concept that I term loyalty, that we can see also in the decision of the Italian government in signing a memorandum of understanding in China under the Belt and Road Initiative, to showing that a particular country is loyal to China. And so some transplant, some legal institution, legal concept are transplanted in a country in order to accomplish not for prestige or for the efficiency of the model, but for showing loyalty to China. Thank you so much. I try to...
Well, thank you so much. Well, thank you very much. Very good presentation. Now, so raise your hands if you want to make some remark. We're only 7 minutes late, so we can discuss a bit. Vincenzo Zeno, please, Professor Zeno.
Oh, just ZOPPOLATO, very interesting. And I think this is an issue that will be sort of central to comparative legal studies in the next decades. I just suggest, I know you're doing a lot of work, but I think what will be interesting to see what is the effect of Chinese, let's use it between quote unquote Chinese neocolonialism in Africa. It'll be very interesting to see in few time what is the effect of this huge investment of Chinese investment, Chinese foreign direct investment in China, and to what extent this investment will change African systems which are not, you cannot classify them here or there, and you can probably will follow where follow what is a dominant sort of region which is dominant in Africa. Just to point out that this will be very interesting when you're talking of transplants, not only in Asia, but also we'll be interested to see what happens in Africa. This is the only point I wanted to make. And for the rest, I think it's something that is, the future is yours, ZOPPOLATO.
I don't think so, but like, thanks for the remarks about Africa. And actually, like, Chinese are moving fast in Africa. Like, for example, like I read something about like Kenya and the building of new physical infrastructure in Kenya. And the problem is that like they are signing like public-private partnership between Chinese state-owned enterprises and local enterprises, but according to Chinese standard. And even for the actual operation of the trains, the system are in Chinese and not in English. So China, by leveraging on its contractual strength, is like forcing, even in the post-operation of like a train infrastructure and so on, to use Chinese companies. And the transplant, I'm going to check in more details. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Kelly Chen, please, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you. Thanks for a very interesting presentation. I agree with you when it comes to that the Belt and Road Initiative will serve as a source of legal transfer, most likely, and being a really good example of state-to-state transfer. And we need to absolutely critically scrutinize these kind of transfers, the relationship between the recepting party and the transplanting party. And this scrutiny it needs to happen, on the same basis, as critical basis, as you always do when you have an imperialistic power, coming strong economic, financial power. What I'm interested in is hearing a little bit more about what your understanding of Chinese law, of contemporary Chinese law. For example, you talk a lot about the Communist Party of China, the supremacy of the Communist Party and so on. But you know that I agree that the social law has had a great impact on modern Chinese law, Chinese legal system. But what about we go a little bit further back? Because the Communist Party took power in 1949. If you take a look at the Chinese history, it's much longer. For example, what do you think about Confucian legal thinking, the normative order on the Confucianism that was the normative order in China for thousands of years, is in fact effect on modern Chinese legal system? One example is that when you talk about legal transplants, China has, for example, incorporated a lot of socialist law in contract law from 1999, for example. But when it comes to transplants of fiduciary principles, of the principle of good faith, these transplants work because they fit with the old Confucian legal normative philosophies. So yeah, and I would really like to hear more about what you think.
Thank you so much for the question. And I agree, like my focus right now is more on the Communist Party of China, because I think that is a kind of underlooked area about the impact of socialist and Soviet transplant, like during even the Republican period. Because if we look at the Joffe Sun Zhongshan, at the Joffe Sun Zhongshan,
Yes.
Sun Zhongshan agreement, like the point is that Soviet have a really important influence. And what are you saying about like the role of Confucianism is also important, because like the need of introducing like declaratory statement into a legal system, like that is a core characteristic of socialist law. When you say like something about principle, there is a tendency in the Chinese legal system to introduce something like declamatory statements in the national law and regulation. So the objective of something, we want to do something. And even at the internal level of the CPC, like last year, they released a really interesting regulation on the hierarchy of sources in party regulation. And at the top of the hierarchy, there is not a constitution, but there is party ideology. But with Confucianism, there is also legalism and unfaith. That it was really much important, and was also a reaction to the protection of upper middle class in Confucian China, that was protecting the status quo. Instead, like with legalism, was the first time that something like a kind of equal treatment of all the people took place, but it lasted like 200 years under the first dynasty.
Okay, yes, sure. Well, some other question or remark, please raise your hand. I don't see other hands. Raise, please.
Sorry, can you just, because I think it's very seldom that we get the opportunity to talk about Chinese law in this way, you know. But I just want to hear, like, when you talk about order, you know, the Communist Party is very focused on order, upholding order in the society and so on. But this idea of upholding law to uphold order in the society, it comes from this Confucianism. It comes thousands of years of idea how the state should be structured. And of course, Confucianism, this kind of philosophical thinking norms are not law. So I'm not saying that. And there was quite a debate on legalism and Confucianism. But I think what's important to emphasize is that these kind of normative orders, these kind of philosophical norms, they still shape the way people think. Today's people of their legal thinking. So when you have Chinese businessmen doing business with other countries, you know, in the international setting, these kind of norms, they still shape their business practices, how they think about contracts and so on. So yeah,
Yeah, okay, thanks for the remark. I think that the focus, like we see under Hu Jintao, the focus on neo-Confucianism value and so on. But I think that is more like an official rhetoric of the leading party to try to find and figure it out a way, a global governance vision that is against the current discourse of the United States. I know that at a business level, I lived in China, like you do business with Baijiu.
Okay.
So then, don't you think it would be a really interesting clash between you, because you look at the state, right? The state regime, how you use the law.
Sorry, Dr. Chen, no, I just, because there's Dr. O'Hare that wants to, so we give space to other participants. Sorry.
We can address that matter. I'm going to send you an email. Don't worry.
Oh, I have a paper to send you.
Sorry. There is a Claire O'Hare willing to make a remark. Please, you have floor.
Thank you. I was really enjoying that exchange, so sorry for interrupting it. It's kind of following on from Dr. Chen's comment about norms and how contracts are interpreted and applied. And in terms of like transplant and how law is actually then interpreted. I was wondering how the new commercial courts, the new international commercial courts that fit within the BRI, fit within your concept of legal transplants, and how you think they will either be part and parcel of that process.
So the new International Commercial Court was a kind of a good innovation for the system because they involved also a lot of like foreign legal experts, and they try like to shift in focus from London and other like fora for international litigation and move it closer like to China. And about legal transplant, it is even true that like 1 month ago they enacted like the civil code, and the Chinese are always like involving foreign experts in drafting procedures. And they are like, even in Chinese academic literature, like they are like the real Roman law country.
Okay. Yes, rather bizarre, but true. Anyhow, there are other questions? No. Okay. So we can end. I just only add something. I think when you are speaking about the party use of Confucianism, you are meaning indeed a grand strategy of China. I mean, it is indifferent from Communist Party or not. It is the grand strategy of China to use Confucianism as an official way of culturalizing the rest of the world, and especially also using European Orientalism. European Orientalists are really in love with Taoism or Confucianism, and they are not interested at all with school of law, of course, with the Fachi art. And so the Chinese are in a way exploiting us in our own beliefs and cultural orientation toward the vast world, of course, of Chinese philosophy. And so I think it's a matter of grand strategy used during a long span of centuries.
I agree.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So if there are no other remarks, well, we can end, Professor Zeno, because there
yes.
Okay. Yes.
We can just give a final announcement of the next.
Before, okay, please.
Oh, just to tell you, well, this is next week. It's the last of the 4 weeks. And so next week on next Thursday, but in the afternoon, 3 p.m., we have the webinar on new technologies on the private law aspects. And on next Friday, we'll have the webinar on new technologies, public law issues. And then I just wanted to warn you well in advance that Thursday, 25th is the final session with Richard Albert, Richard Kay, Giuseppe Franco Ferrari, Elise Poyot, and Matthias Sims, Comparative Law après le déluge. And so, I mean, just to keep in mind, these are the next appointments for our webinars. So next Thursday, 18th, Friday 19th, and then the final webinar in the late afternoon of Thursday the 25th.
Okay, great. I wish to thank again CHEN, Claire O'Hare, Anna Katharina SUZUKI-KLASEN, Vanessa Villanueva, Davide ZOPPOLATO for their presentations, and you all for participating. It has been a wonderful occasion to gather together, and thank you, Professor Zeno, and all the others for this wonderful organization and transforming a normal conference of 2 days in a conference of 1 month. And we shall meet again on the next week. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
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 Thank you so much.
Thank you.